we all know this is what was happening. But I think what a lot of people don't know is that in 1994, our government actually inherited from the apartheid states a significant amount of debt. We all know that debt has become a big topic in South Africa. What does our minister say? We don't have the money, right? We've got a lot of debt. But the debt to GDP ratio in South Africa in 1994 was 50%, over 50%. What is important about this political moment is that we had a lot of heterodox, or people who didn't believe in the mainstream, economists in South Africa. But what ended up happening is that the ones who had been trained by the World Bank and the IMF and Goldman Sachs in 1992 become team finance. So the National Treasury we inherit, or the people who go into it, are people who are trained in a particular way of understanding the economy. So what we get is a neoliberal approach to macroeconomics. The government was really concerned about how the market would see it, which is why we decided to take on this debt. Do you want to know how long it took for government to pay off apartheid debt? Does anyone know? I know it's a big room, so it's kind of hard. But we paid off this debt until 2001. How many of you guys were born in 2001? Probably not any of you, some of you maybe. So we paid off this debt. For a long time into our new democracy, we were paying off debt instead of using that money to invest in our economy. In 1996, the government implemented what is called GEAR, Growth, Employment and Redistribution. And what I can tell you as a summary of what GEAR is, it is basically like the perfect recipe for neoliberalism. And what is neoliberalism? I hope some of you know what it is. It's a combination of stabilization, liberalization, privatization, and rationalization. What is also interesting is in South Africa in the 90s, we had a lot of protests against privatization. And guess what's come back in 2025? Privatization. What is happening to Eskom, Transnet, our state-owned entities? Pushed towards privatization. I won't go through most of this, but to really say that South Africa became a democracy at a time where financialized capitalism, right? So when we talk about stock markets and all these financial sectors were becoming more important. So what that meant is that more and more people were putting their money in the banks than doing what? Investing in brick and mortar. We weren't building factories anymore, which is why South Africa is deindustrialized. We spent a lot of that money into what is called the financial economy and not the real economy. So those are the beginnings of austerity. Has anyone ever heard the word austerity before? Raise your hand if you know what austerity is. No? Okay. This is a very important word of your generation. So basically, Netsi, I can't say his name, but basically he was the head of communications. He said that South Africa had basically employed its own structural adjustment program. If anyone knows anything about World Bank structural adjustment programs, is that since the 70s, they led to what is called the lost decade in Latin America. So there was low growth, there were crises. In Zambia, for example, the first time that there was ever a food protest was when structural adjustment programs were implemented. And what are structural adjustment programs? They were basically saying, disinvest from government, disinvest from the public sector, right? So cut government spending on the public sector so that the private sector can provision. But will the private sector provision? It's the question, right? So austerity, some of you who maybe follow me on Twitter, my name is Busi Anti-Austerity Circle. Very important, because austerity is a policy implemented by the state to solve debt and growth problems during a period of weak economic growth. South Africa's growth has been very weak since the beginning, and what we've done is gradually cut budgets over time, or not spend enough, or invest enough in our economy. And what has happened is that we've eroded the public sector in itself. Why do governments implement austerity when it's so bad? It's because the whole idea is that when government spends, it is crowding out private sector. So what is government trying to do? Enable private sector to do the work that it should be doing technically. So I'm not going to go through all of this again, but just to show you importantly, this is real GDP growth in South Africa. So you see there that our GDP growth has never really been that amazing, except pre-2008. Before the financial crisis, the global markets were doing great. Thabo Mbeki was president, and everyone thinks that's the best era, but we can debate whether he really drove growth, because I don't think so. but to really say that this is when our economy was growing. We've had many other policies after the GEAR, which are all still neoliberal policies. So why do I start here? I start here because in feminist economics there's a concept of social reproduction. How is society organized in terms of production and reproduction? And reproduction means how we reproduce ourselves in our households. For you guys to show up here, you woke up, you are reproducing yourself, you showered, you ate, you walked, you got here, you got dressed. All those things are part of reproducing yourself. For a child to grow, to be part of the labor force, somebody has to birth them, somebody has to raise them. And that work tends to be undervalued and not spoken enough about. Policy is part of the system, whether you are in the workplace or at home or in between. We reproduce society through policy, right? So part of this is patriarchal institutions, the state, and again, like I said, macroeconomic policy are important. And so macroeconomic policy plays a significant role in how we are organized as a society to produce not only in the markets, as in jobs and factories, but also in our households. So that's why I start there. But to the more fun parts, because I always like to start with the theoretical. But now I'm going to show you what is happening. So first I wanted to start with the infamous Marx. Unemployment. Why is there unemployment? Marx says, it is the very nature of the capitalist mode of production to overwork some workers while keeping the rest as a reserve army of unemployed paupers. What does that mean? It means that unemployment is a structural feature of capitalism. There will always be unemployment in a capitalist system. Why? Because if there's no unemployment, you can't exploit the workers. So some people have to be unemployed so that they're willing to take the low-paying jobs so that capitalists can extract from them, exploit them, have profits from them, right? So the function of the proletariat within the capitalist system is to provide a reserve army of labor that creates downward pressure on wages, which is what I've just said, and therefore dividing between those who are surplus labor and underemployment. So we talk a lot about unemployment, but there's also a concept of underemployment. Does anyone know what underemployment means? You can just wave at me a bit. No? Underemployment means you are here, you're going to graduate, you're going to get your degree. Yay! And then you go to the job market and you can't find a job that pays you what your degree was worth, or at least what you paid for this degree. So you end up in a job, in a low-skilled job, let's say you go to work at McDonald's, right? So your skills versus the job you're doing, right, the skills that you've learned in your studies versus what you're doing is a resultant in underemployment. You're being underemployed on the basis of your skills versus where you are. So looking at the unemployment statistics, an unemployed person is someone who is not in employment, not in work for pay or profit, someone who is seeking for work, pay or profit, and who is available for work, pay or profit. I hope you guys have seen this definition before, because I think we assume that unemployment just means somebody who's sitting at home. But there's an important part of this. You have to be actively seeking a job to be considered unemployed. So if you're not looking for a job, you are considered a discouraged job seeker. So the statistics tell us the story, but it's not always the true story, right? Because it doesn't include a lot of people. So South Africa now has an expanded definition of unemployment, which then features these people who are not actively necessarily looking for jobs. But what's also important here is the definition of work, right? Work. What do your mothers do at home? If your mom doesn't have a paid job, what does she do at home? She works, right? She works. But that's not considered work. When we look at the unemployment trends, people are always saying we've got this unemployment crisis. But we've actually got a protracted crisis, right? So if you look at the unemployment statistics, our unemployment has always been high in South Africa. It's always been high. So again, going back to the macroeconomic policies I was telling you, they're reproducing this unemployment. What we're doing in macroeconomic policy is not generating jobs. I just want to check the time so that I'm not going over. Yes, so going into spatial apartheid and unemployment, what's important here to note is that, of course, because there was apartheid and a spatial segregation of people, there are areas or provinces that obviously disproportionately have more unemployment, right? The apartheid state wasn't interested in developing the whole South Africa. It was only interested in developing where there was what we call the minerals energy complex, right? So our capitalist accumulation was driven through the mineral energy complex, which is obviously your ESCOMs, your coal industry, your mining industry, and not necessarily about developing the whole country as a whole. Ben Fine actually says that South Africa was more of a developmental state during apartheid than it is today. And why does he say that? He says that in a developmental state, you would not have load shedding. Right? So South Africa right now is failing on many parts, including development of many areas. I mean, we in the Eastern Cape. And I was telling my friend, I said, you know, Eastern Cape, it's so big. It would be a great case study for how to make fast trains between the whole province. So people could get to places, and of course she said to me, they'll eat all that money, you'll never see a train. So, unfortunate. The gendered nature of unemployment. So we all know that black and colored women have disproportionately higher levels of unemployment than any other race or gender. And this actually goes back to how capitalism was designed to be enforced that differentiated not only the tasks that women and men should perform, but the experiences, their lives, their relation to capital, and to other sectors of the working class. So really what this is to say is that when capitalism began, there was no conceptualization that women would be in paid labor. Women's role was to provide the care work at home, to reproduce the labor, right? Because they have to give work to the labor, they have to raise the labor, but they're not the labor force. They are reproducing the labor force. So capitalism in that way exploited the sexual division of labor. And of course, later on, women joined the workforce, right? I'm here today because, you know, the world has changed. But to say that initially when the labor market was feminized, when women joined the market, what initially happened in some sectors is that actually they dropped the salaries and wages. Right? So women would then join at a lower wage. But importantly, there remains a gender wage gap in South Africa. Has anybody ever read about the gender wage gap? Do you know that women on average earn 30% less than their male counterparts in sectors? And black women even higher. The labor force participation rates among women remain lower than men, of course. But again, this is a historic function. Women weren't supposed to be a part of the labor force. But as capitalism does, it always reforms, it always changes. So, when more labor power was needed, women could join the labor force. But also what is important to note about the South African context is that women continue to be more vulnerable in the labor market. Women stay longer without jobs, so if you lose your job today, you are more likely to stay out of the labor market for longer compared to men. And most importantly, during the COVID pandemic, what did we see? We saw that 2 out of 3 people who lost their jobs in the pandemic were women, right? Last one's in, first one's out, right? And this is the problem of economics, the individual. If you've ever taken an economics class, you know that there's this man, Robinson Crusoe, he's obviously a man, right? And he's rational, self-interested, independent, has no responsibility towards anyone. All he has to decide is between his leisure time and work. What's the assumption there? What do economic models assume? Most of them assume full employment, that there are always jobs available for everyone. So therefore, we can always choose between a job and labor, or wages versus labor, right? Participate or leisure rather. So that's one of the flaws of economic models, and most macroeconomic models that I used assume full employment. Do you have full employment in South Africa? Is there any country that has full employment? None, right? So why is it that these models continue to be used? So these models are biased, right? There's also the methods, the way that they're mathematical. I know Mandisi was telling me, Professor Mandisi was telling me now, not too much math, and I said, I won't do the math thing, I'll do a different thing. So a lot of focus on the math. The economists love the equations, the formulas to understand things. And so there's been a narrow focus, and there's a great paper about economics that talks about the mathematization, I don't know if I say the word, of economics. I always say in my undergrad degree, I did not study economics, I studied math. I had 10 classes of math, basically, right? Do I ever use it? No, luckily for me. I don't think my professors would be proud of that. And then coming back to this concept of austerity, I told you about austerity. Austerity has been used, budget cuts or tax increases that are being used to solve government debt programs. Matei, there's a great book, if you're interested in a book up that talks about politics, actually talks about classism and austerity, and it talks about the working class and how austerity creates and reproduces the working class in a particular way. So here she talks about just how austerity has led to higher unemployment, which is also partially what's happening in South Africa. We can have a debate about whether there's austerity in South Africa. I argue that there's austerity in South Africa. And wages decrease, and a lot of other things happen that are negative. The other thing is to say that austerity is a feature of capitalism. You can't have capitalism without austerity. Austerity is there, designed, again, like I said, to decrease the influence of the public sector. So how does capitalism thrive? It's when public sector rescinds, and then we have what? Privatized provisioning of things. And then in one of my first papers that I wrote on austerity, I said, austerity has been used to legitimize a desire to shrink the role of the state, deregulate labor markets, emphasize private markets as the drivers of growth, and enable a reconfiguration in the interests of capital, particularly the financial sector, which is why South Africa is a hyper-financialized economy. So on poverty, Naila Kabir, who's a feminist economist, very well known, she says the processes of poverty can be divided into those which explain why poor people remain poor over extended periods of time, the so-called poverty trap, and those which explain why people both poor and non-poor become poorer over time. So I think this is a very important conceptualization of how do we understand why people are poor and what happens, or the processes of poverty. So in South Africa, poverty is multidimensional, so I want to start to say, I won't cover all the elements of poverty, but to say that we know that in 2022, our president said, the face of poverty in our country is the face of an African woman. Right? Poverty patterns continue to be gendered, with female-headed households more likely to have low incomes, depend on social grants, and have fewer employed members. And we know that the typical profile of a poor household in South Africa is one that is headed by a black female under the age of 35 in a rural area with lower levels of education and most likely to be unemployed and is situated in the lower income quintiles. Asda, who is Asda Adelseta, who's got this great model, basically did an index that shows multidimensional poverty, and it's a very fancy. This model literally has 10,000 equations. And he came up with this data, right, to show us that in terms of multidimensional poverty, over 60% of the black population faces severe deprivation, compared only with 16% of Indian Asian and 17% of white populations. Moreover, women are more vulnerable to deprivation than men. I mean, tell me something new. I think we all kind of know this, right? In terms of basic services, a topic that not many people talk about, and actually a topic of my PhD study, is on basic services. We know that basic services are important, of course. We all like water, I hope, and we like to have clean water. But what is happening in South Africa is that in some areas we're seeing a regression, right? I don't know if you've heard, and maybe some of you pay electricity. Electricity is incredibly expensive. Electricity tariffs have increased by 177% over 10 years. Our salary is increasing that fast. I wish our salaries were increasing that fast. Water tariffs by 213%. Water is becoming expensive. Rates and taxes by 118%. right, in 10 years. So what is happening is that many people are unable to provide or to purchase or use basic services. Of course, women who are more exposed to basic services because they do disproportionately more of the care work, right? Cooking, cleaning, which all require water as an input, right? All that care work requires basic services. So in the absence of basic services, they're disproportionately impacted. I just want to highlight for you here on the graphs. The graphs here show the number of persons without access to basic services. And I think what's shocking in South Africa is the number of people without, especially solid waste management, and we take this for granted. The fact that somebody comes to pick up your trash has increased. The number of people without water has increased. The only things we see improvement in is electricity and storage and sanitation, which is great. But then when you look at the number of people getting, there's a program called the Free Basic Services Package in South Africa, where if you're an indigent household, you can get a package of free basic services. The numbers of those households are decreasing. Why is that? Because of austerity, of course. But why is that? It's because municipalities don't want to give people that money, if I could put it simply. They don't want to give people that money. And why? Because of austerity again. Everything's because of austerity. But because they don't have the money. And so they use that money for other things, maintenance and so forth, and deprive these households that could actually benefit from free basic services. Just to highlight here, because I know I want more time for questions than me speaking, but to basically say time poverty, a lot of people don't talk about time poverty and how women disproportionately suffer from time poverty. So if you're a girl child at home, and let's say you grew up with brothers, like myself, you had a lot of time poverty if your siblings didn't help with household chores. You came back home, you washed the dishes, you helped clean, you helped take care of your other siblings, and what did your brothers do? They were playing, having a great time, leisure time, right? So you were time poor. And a lot of women in our country are time poor. And this is also shown during the HIV epidemic and COVID pandemic. And why is austerity dangerous? It's because when government cuts expenditure to services like health, it is women who pick up the slack. When people were dying during the HIV and AIDS epidemic, it was women who took care of people, right? It was communities that took care of people. So it's always easy to cut the things where you know that women can be the buffer. They can provide where you're not providing, right? When you don't provide early childhood development, it is Ukoko next door who takes care of the child, right? Or somebody. The timely survey, South Africa used to have a timely survey, and the 2000 and 2010 timely survey showed that women were saying, I can't look for a job. And they're exploited, and so women are undervalued and underpaid, right, in many ways. And so basic services here are important, and I've already spoken to this. So, like the true millennial I am, I put up some of my tweets. So poverty and social assistance. Everybody's always saying, yo, grants, people are getting free money. A lot of free money going to people who deserve. And I wanted to highlight in these string of tweets, I think I couldn't summarize it any better, to say that there were 28 million grant recipients, most of whom are people who actually cannot work. They're not working age people. Majority of grants are for children. Can children work? Is it legal for children to even work? No, right? So our grants cover the most vulnerable in our society, which are the children, the elderly, the disabled, people in foster care, people who are cared for, and of course now we've got the COVID-19 SRG, after realizing after a long time that people are systematically excluded from the workforce. But I wanted to highlight here in the middle tweets to say that these numbers don't factor in dependency ratios. So if you've got one person working for every 4 people in a household, what's the minimum wage? Anyone know what the minimum wage is? Just over 4,000 rand. So if you've got one person working in an average household of 4.4, which is the average household in South Africa, it means each person in the house gets 1,000 rand. Is that enough? Right? So of course it's not enough. So we have to think about, in a household that's predominantly women, we already know women are systematically excluded, right? 70% of children live with their mothers. And mothers are mostly unemployed, which is a structural issue. So we have to respond to that, right? And then we also need to talk about, of course, because they're also working. Another thing I wanted to highlight is people forget that our parents need old age grants because they worked in the apartheid system and they didn't have provident funds. They didn't have retirement benefits. So it's inevitable that they're going to need this assistance. It's not because they want to have this assistance or, it is a structure or an outcome of what has happened in the past. And we have to reckon with that our parents did not get provident funds. They worked hard. They were taxed highly, especially black colored parents, right? And they don't have retirement money. So what I really say in these tweets say, whenever we talk about grants and the undeserving poor, what we really are is being anti-woman, because we're saying what must those women do? And inevitably we're saying that children say this, which is that social grants have been expanded in South Africa, so more people are receiving social grants now than in 1994. But what's important to note is that the value in real terms, so when you take into account inflation, the value of the grants actually hasn't increased. They're increasing in nominal numbers, so when the budget is announced, they're like, 20 and more. But when you take into account inflation, the values actually haven't increased significantly over time, right? But it's declining over time. I always say that what is interesting to me is that why is the child grant the lowest value out of all the grants? Why is it? Because women will make a plan, right? Why is the foster care grant so low? Why are the grants that are relative to children so low? It's because we assume that this work will be done elsewhere. People will make a plan. On inequality, I'm concluding here. I like to talk about South Africa's inequality. I always want to start with corporates. We always start with Gini coefficients, and income and stuff. But I want to highlight that South African corporations make a lot of money. South African corporations make a lot of money. And I put this picture of Mamush here because I want us to remember Baitana and how Anglo did not want to give them more money, even though when you look at their profits, they could have easily given them more money, right? So corporates, to me, are a big driver of inequality. And also there's a large concentration of, or market concentration in South Africa, which means there are few companies that actually own a lot of, when you think of the Foschini group, how many companies are part of that? It's one group, though, right? So you've got these firms that are basically like large firms that own a lot of things. I saw Pick and Pay, all of these ones buying out, Boxer and Pick and Pay and Smamba and Shop. Like everyone is really actually interconnected, even though they've got different names. So we've had a lot of financialization, but what's also happening is that we've got a large misallocation of capital. And what do I mean by that is that a lot of money is flowing into sectors and internationally and not into our real economy. Again, what is real economy is brick and mortar. We've got a lot of speculative financing in the markets, so we're really not seeing the benefits of that on the ground, right? I'd also lastly to highlight, and I didn't want to go on and on, we could talk about this for a long time, but to basically say that despite South Africa having a statutory tax rate of 28%, companies, what they actually pay is lower than that. Can individuals easily run away from tax? If you earn over $1 million and above, you get taxed 45%. Corporates make what? Millions, some billions, and they get taxed 28%, and they still run away from the 20%. So the average effective tax rate between 2011 and 2015 in South Africa is all our incomes together as a country. The bottom 50, half of us, only have 5.3% of that total income. The top 10% has 66.5%. That paid all the things that are due, and if you consider debt,